February 1943, minus 30 degrees Celsius on the outskirts of Stalingrad. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter crouched behind the shattered remains of a brick factory, his fingers so numb inside his gloves that he could barely feel the metal of his weapon. Around him, what remained of his unit, 11 men from the original 43, huddled against walls that offered protection from the wind, but nothing from the cold that turned breath into ice crystals before it left your mouth. They believed their superior training and German engineering would see them through. They believed their weapons were the finest the world had produced. By nightfall, every single one of those beliefs would be shattered by a truth so simple, so obvious, that it would haunt Richter for the rest of his life. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Richter and thousands of others were about to discover was that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is no match for brutal simplicity, and that engineering excellence means nothing when it cannot adapt to the reality of where war is actually fought. Richter had been in the conflict since the summer of 1941, 22 months of advancing, then retreating, then holding impossible positions against impossible odds. His weapon, a standard-issue submachine gun, had been his constant companion through all of it. German engineering at its finest, or so the instructors had told them during training in Bavaria, where the temperature rarely dropped below freezing, and the rain was the worst weather they encountered. The weapon was a masterpiece of modern manufacturing: pressed steel components, simplified production techniques, light, compact, reliable. The specifications read like poetry to military engineers: 9mm rounds, cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute, effective range of 100 meters. Richter had memorized every number during training. He had field-stripped and reassembled the weapon blindfolded. He knew the name of every single part. Lieutenant Werner Schultz, their young officer, who still somehow maintained a crisp uniform despite 3 weeks without proper resupply, moved between the men with words of encouragement that sounded increasingly hollow. He was 24 years old, a graduate of officer school who had arrived at the front in October with textbook knowledge and unshakable confidence in German superiority. "The Soviets are poorly equipped," Schultz told them, repeating what higher command continued to insist, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. "Their weapons are crude, their tactics primitive. We simply need to hold until reinforcements arrive." Richter said nothing. He had learned in recent months that contradicting officers, even gently, was not worth the trouble. But he exchanged glances with Feldwebel Otto Baumann, a veteran of the previous world conflict who had survived 4 years in the trenches and possessed the kind of cynical wisdom that only comes from seeing grand strategies collapse into mud and blood. Baumann was 41 years old, too old for this. With 3 children at home, he spoke about constantly. He had taught Richter more about actual survival than any training manual. He had also taught him the most important lesson of all: when reality contradicts doctrine, believe reality. The attack came at 1400 hours, announced by the distinctive sound of Soviet weapons chattering across the frozen landscape. Not the careful, measured firing that German tactical doctrine emphasized, but sustained bursts that seemed to go on forever. Richter pressed himself against the wall as rounds chewed into the brick above his head, sending red dust cascading down onto his helmet. He raised his weapon, aimed at shadows moving through the smoke of burning buildings 300 meters away, and squeezed the trigger. 3 rounds fired. Then nothing. The bolt had frozen solid. "Scheiße," he muttered, pulling the weapon close to his body, trying to use his own meager body heat to thaw the mechanism. It was not the first time. It was not even the first time that day. In the minus 30-degree cold, the weapon froze constantly. The oil they had been issued, perfect for European climates, turned to sludge in these temperatures. The close tolerances that made the weapon so accurate became its fatal weakness when ice formed between moving parts. Around him, he heard the same curse repeated by other men. Click. Nothing. Frozen again. Meanwhile, the Soviet fire continued unabated, those distinctive bursts that went on, 12 rounds, 20 rounds, 30 rounds without pause. "Return fire," Schultz shouted, but the order was pointless. Half the weapons in their position had frozen solid. The other half fired a few rounds before jamming. Men worked bolts frantically, trying to clear malfunctions that had nothing to do with mechanical failure and everything to do with physics and poor planning. The Soviet advance stalled not because of German resistance, but because their own command pulled them back. Richter would learn later that the Soviets had learned to be cautious, to probe defenses rather than rush forward into German traps. But in that moment, as the firing died down and his hands shook from cold and fear, he felt only the bitter knowledge that his weapon had failed him when he needed it most. Night fell early at that latitude in February. By 1600 hours, darkness had claimed the ruined city, broken only by fires that burned in collapsed buildings and the occasional flare that turned shadows into dancing monsters. The temperature dropped further, approaching -35. Richter had lost feeling in his toes hours ago. He tried not to think about frostbite, about gangrene, about amputation. Baumann appeared beside him, moving with the careful silence of a man who had survived too long to make careless noise. The Feldwebel carried something in his arms, wrapped in a torn piece of canvas. "Found this in the rubble," Baumann said quietly, "from one of the Soviet positions we overran last week." He unwrapped the canvas to reveal a Soviet submachine gun. Richter had seen them before, carried by enemy soldiers, distinctive with their curved magazines and simple construction. Intelligence reports dismissed them as crude, inferior, the product of a backwards industrial system. But Baumann was looking at the weapon with something approaching reverence. "I have been watching them," Baumann said. "In this cold, when our weapons freeze after 3 rounds, I watch their soldiers fire 30, 40, 50 rounds without stopping, every time, no matter how cold it gets." He held the Soviet weapon out to Richter. "Take it, examine it, tell me what you see." Richter took the weapon hesitantly. It was heavier than his own, built from stamped steel that looked rough compared to the finished surfaces of German manufacturing. The wood stock was crude, obviously mass-produced with minimal craftsmanship. Everything about it screamed inferior production, rushed manufacturing, low quality. But as Richter turned it over in his hands, something else began to emerge. The tolerances were loose. You could see gaps between components, spaces that would horrify any precision manufacturer. The finish was rough. The stock wobbled slightly. By every technical standard he had been taught, this weapon was inferior. "Now field strip it," Baumann ordered. Richter hesitated. He had never handled a Soviet weapon before, did not know the mechanism. But Baumann guided him through it, and within minutes Richter had the weapon disassembled on his lap. The inside was as crude as the outside, simple components, minimal parts, everything oversized, over-engineered in the opposite direction from German design. Where his weapon had tight tolerances and precision fitting, this had gaps and loose connections. Where his weapon had careful finishing and exact specifications, this had rough edges and approximate measurements. "Do you see it?" Baumann asked. "Do you understand?" Richter stared at the components spread before him, and slowly, like dawn breaking over a frozen landscape, understanding came. Those loose tolerances, those gaps between parts, those oversized components, they were not flaws. They were features. They were intentional. "The gaps," Richter said slowly. "When ice forms, there is room for it. The parts still move." "Exactly," Baumann said. "And the oil?" Richter examined the weapon's interior. There was oil present, but different from what they used, thinner. He touched it with his finger. Even in the extreme cold, it remained liquid. "They use different oil," Richter said, "something that does not freeze." "They engineer for the environment they actually fight in," Baumann said, "while we engineer for the environment we wish we were fighting in. We make weapons for a war in France, then act surprised when they fail in Russia." He began reassembling the Soviet weapon with practiced ease. "I have been collecting these from fallen Soviet soldiers for 2 weeks. I have 6 now, hidden in various positions. When the attack comes tomorrow, and it will come tomorrow, you can hear them preparing. I will use this, because I want to live, because I have 3 children who need their father. Because superiority on paper means nothing when your weapon is a frozen club." The words hung in the cold air like an accusation, not against Baumann, but against the entire system that had sent them here with equipment designed for a different war in a different place. Richter thought about the production numbers he had heard cited. Germany manufactured approximately 1 million of his weapon type during the conflict. Precision manufacturing, quality control, advanced engineering. Meanwhile, the Soviets produced over 5 million of their crude submachine guns, 5 million weapons built with loose tolerances and simple components, weapons that worked in -30-degree cold because they were designed by people who knew what -30 degrees meant. "I want one," Richter said quietly. "Can you help me find one?" Baumann smiled grimly. "Tomorrow, after the attack, there will be plenty of opportunities. The Soviets are not short of weapons. They are not short of anything anymore." That night, Richter could not sleep, not just because of the cold, though that was bad enough, but because his entire understanding of the conflict had shifted. He thought about the training back in Germany, the instructors proudly displaying German weapons, explaining their superiority over Soviet equipment. He thought about the technical specifications, the precision manufacturing, the advanced engineering. All of it true, all of it useless, because superiority is contextual. A weapon is only superior if it works in the conditions where it will actually be used. Precision means nothing if precision parts freeze solid. Advanced engineering means nothing if it cannot adapt to environmental reality. He thought about the Soviet factories, often described in intelligence reports as primitive, backwards, inefficient. Yet those primitive factories were producing 5 weapons for every one Germany made. Those backwards engineers had solved the problem of winter warfare, while German engineers were still insisting their designs were perfect. The attack came at dawn, announced by a barrage from Soviet artillery that had been silent for days. Richter crouched in his position, his German weapon set aside, a Soviet submachine gun held ready in his hands. Around him, several other men had made the same choice. Baumann carried 2 Soviet weapons, one in each hand. Schultz noticed, of course. The young officer stared at his men with something between horror and disbelief. "You cannot use enemy weapons," he shouted over the thunder of incoming shells. "It is against regulations. It is dishonorable." "So is dying with a frozen weapon in your hands," Baumann shouted back. "I respectfully suggest the lieutenant focus on surviving the next hour, and we can discuss honor later." The Soviet infantry came through the smoke and dust of the barrage like grey ghosts, hundreds of them, advancing in small groups, using cover expertly, moving with the confidence of soldiers who knew they had momentum on their side. They were not the poorly trained conscripts of 1941. These were veterans, hardened by 2 years of brutal conflict, equipped with weapons that actually worked in their homeland's winter. Richter aimed at a group moving through the ruins of a collapsed warehouse and squeezed the trigger. The Soviet weapon roared to life, bucking in his hands, spitting rounds downrange in a sustained burst that went on and on. 10 rounds, 15, 20. The weapon kept firing, reliable, unstoppable. He released the trigger, adjusted his aim, fired again. Another long burst. The weapon was hot in his hands despite the freezing temperature. Around him, the distinctive chatter of Soviet submachine guns filled the air. But half the sound was coming from his own position, German soldiers firing Soviet weapons, because German weapons had failed them. The irony was so profound it was almost funny. Almost. The engagement lasted 40 minutes before the Soviet forces withdrew to regroup. When silence fell again, broken only by the moans of wounded and the crackle of fires, Richter looked down at the weapon in his hands. It was hot, the barrel radiating heat into the frozen air. He had fired perhaps 200 rounds. The weapon had not jammed once, had not hesitated, had not frozen. His German weapon lay beside him, bolt still frozen solid from yesterday. Schultz was pale, shaking. Whether from cold or shock or the recognition of reality, Richter could not tell. The young officer looked at his men, saw the Soviet weapons in their hands, opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. What could he say? They had survived. His doctrine had failed. "Herr Leutnant," Baumann said with careful respect, "I suggest we officially recognize that our men are using captured weapons. For the record, we can note that standard equipment has proven unsuitable for current environmental conditions. I will draft a report if you wish." Schultz nodded slowly, mechanically. "Yes, a report. Environmental conditions." He looked down at his own weapon, which had frozen during the engagement, leaving him unable to contribute to the defense. They never told us it would be like this. In training, they said our equipment was the best in the world. It is the best, Richter said quietly, for fighting in Germany, for fighting in France, for fighting anywhere except where we actually are. Over the following days, the phenomenon spread. More German soldiers acquired Soviet weapons. Not secretly, not in shame, but openly, pragmatically. Officers stopped protesting. Sergeants started organizing collection efforts. Within a week, perhaps half the remaining German soldiers in that sector carried Soviet weapons as primary arms, with their German weapons kept as backups for when temperatures rose above freezing. The Soviet forces seemed to find this amusing. Prisoners taken during a small engagement a week later were questioned about it. A Red Army sergeant, a man named Dmitry Volkov, who spoke some German, laughed when asked about German soldiers using Soviet weapons. "Of course you use them," Volkov said. "They work. This is not complicated. We build weapons for Russian winter because we know Russian winter. You build weapons for your war, not for ours. Now you fight our war with our weapons. Maybe this teaches you something." He gestured around at the ruins of Stalingrad. "You come here with perfect machines and perfect plans and perfect confidence. You think you are superior because your weapons have tight tolerances and our weapons have gaps. But gaps are not flaws when they let ice form without stopping the weapon. Simplicity is not primitive when it means a soldier can field strip and clean his weapon with frozen fingers in the dark." The sergeant leaned forward, and despite being a prisoner, despite having lost his engagement, he spoke with absolute certainty. "You make 1 million perfect weapons. We make 5 million good enough weapons. When the war is over, who do you think has more working weapons? Who has more soldiers still armed? Perfection that breaks is not perfection. It is just expensive failure." Richter thought about those words for days afterward. Expensive failure. It was a perfect description of so much they had been told, so much they had believed. He thought about the industrial planning that had gone into his weapon, the precision machining required to maintain those tight tolerances, the specialized tooling needed for production, the quality control that ensured every weapon met exact specifications, all of it impressive, all of it representing tremendous engineering skill and manufacturing sophistication. And all of it less effective than Soviet factories, stamping out crude but functional weapons that prioritized working in the actual conditions of the actual war being fought. Baumann, who collected information the way some men collected medals, had learned more details from prisoners and deserters. The Soviet submachine gun had been designed by engineers who understood they were building for mass production and harsh conditions. The loose tolerances were not compromises forced by primitive manufacturing. They were deliberate choices. The simple components were not evidence of technological backwardness, they were evidence of tactical wisdom. They designed for reality. Baumann explained to a group of younger soldiers one evening, "We designed for theory. Reality always wins." He held up a Soviet weapon, running his hand along its rough finish. This weapon was probably built by a factory worker who learned the job in 2 weeks, maybe an old woman, maybe a teenager. The factory probably had no heat. The workers probably made this while hungry and cold and exhausted. And despite all that, they produced a weapon that works better in these conditions than what we built in heated factories with master craftsmen and precision tools. One of the younger soldiers, barely 18, asked the question they were all thinking. "Does that mean we are losing?" Baumann was quiet for a long moment. "We are fighting an enemy who can replace everything faster than we can eliminate it. An enemy who builds simple weapons that work instead of complicated weapons that impress. An enemy who has learned to prioritize function over form, results over perfection. What do you think that means?" The silence that followed was answer enough. February turned to March, and temperatures slowly climbed towards survivable levels, -20, -15, even a few days near -10. As it warmed, something interesting happened. German weapons began working again. Bolts that had been frozen solid for weeks suddenly cycled smoothly. Mechanisms that had jammed reliably at -30 functioned perfectly at -10. Richter found himself with 2 working weapons. His original German submachine gun, which had been his constant companion for 22 months, now functioned beautifully in the warmer weather. And his acquired Soviet weapon, which had kept him alive when his German weapon failed. He should have been happy, should have returned to his original weapon with relief. But something had changed. Not in the weapons, but in him. He kept the Soviet weapon as his primary, because he had learned that reliability in the worst conditions was more valuable than perfection in optimal conditions, because he trusted something that worked when everything was terrible more than something that only worked when things were acceptable, because he had learned that superior engineering means nothing if it cannot adapt to reality. Schultz, who had aged years in the months since their conversation about enemy weapons, never returned to citing doctrine or technical superiority. He carried a Soviet weapon himself now, his German submachine gun abandoned in the ruins somewhere. He was quieter, less certain. His textbook confidence eroded by the reality of survival. In mid-March, new orders came. They were pulling back, giving up positions they had held for months, retreating further west. The great campaign that had started with such confidence in summer 1941 was unraveling, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the steady inevitability of ice melting in spring. As they prepared to move, Richter packed his equipment carefully. Food, spare ammunition, extra clothing, water container, and 2 weapons. The Soviet submachine gun went in his primary position, readily accessible. His German weapon, cleaned and oiled, went on his back as a secondary. Baumann noticed and nodded approvingly. "You have learned the most important lesson," the older man said. "Pride is expensive. Survival is priceless. A weapon is just a tool. The tool that works is the tool you use." They moved out at dawn, a column of exhausted men trudging through snow that was finally beginning to melt. Behind them, Soviet forces were preparing their next advance. Ahead, more defensive positions, more retreats, more months of grinding attrition. But Richter carried something with him now beyond his weapons and equipment. He carried understanding. He had learned that technical superiority is meaningless without contextual appropriateness, that elegant engineering is worthless if it fails under real conditions, that sometimes the crude solution is the superior solution because it actually works. He thought about the factories back home, still producing weapons with tight tolerances and precision manufacturing. He thought about engineers still proud of their advanced designs. He thought about all the other soldiers who would arrive at the front with the same confidence he had once possessed, who would learn the same harsh lessons he had learned, and he wondered if anyone back home understood what he now knew, that they were fighting an enemy who had figured out that 5 million good enough weapons would beat 1 million perfect weapons every single time. The war continued for more than 2 years after that brutal winter. Richter survived, though many others did not. Baumann made it home to his 3 children, though he left part of himself in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Schultz was transferred to a different sector, and eventually to a training command, where perhaps he taught younger officers to value reality over doctrine. After the war, military historians would study the conflict with academic interest. They would analyze production figures. Germany produced approximately 1 million of the standard submachine gun type, while the Soviet Union produced over 5 million of their model. They would note the technical specifications, the engineering approaches, the manufacturing philosophies. But those dry numbers could not capture what Richter had learned in that frozen factory. That engineering excellence divorced from environmental reality is just expensive failure dressed in precision specifications. That the most sophisticated solution is worthless if it cannot function where war is actually fought. That sometimes the greatest advantage is not having the best equipment, but having equipment that reliably works when nothing else does. He kept the Soviet weapon after the war ended, though possessing enemy military equipment was technically illegal. He stored it carefully, oiled and maintained, a reminder of the winter when all his certainties had frozen solid and the crude weapon of his enemies had kept him alive. In later years, when military historians interviewed him about his experiences, Richter would always return to the same point. "We were told our weapons were superior," he would say, "and by every technical measure they were. Better machining, tighter tolerances, more advanced engineering. But superiority is not about specifications. It is about performance where it matters. And where it mattered, in -30-degree cold with our lives depending on our weapons working, the crude Soviet design was infinitely superior to our engineering masterpiece. He would pause, remembering frozen fingers and chattering Soviet weapons and the horrible moment when he had squeezed the trigger and nothing had happened. They built weapons for the war they were actually fighting. We built weapons for the war we thought we should be fighting. That difference decided everything. The lessons from that winter eventually informed military doctrine worldwide. The recognition that environmental testing must match operational reality. The understanding that loose tolerances can be a feature rather than a flaw. The acceptance that sometimes simple and reliable beats complex and capable. But these lessons came too late for the thousands of soldiers who fought that winter with weapons that failed when they needed them most. Too late for the men who learned, as Richter learned, that pride in engineering excellence means nothing when your weapon is a frozen club, and the enemy's crude submachine gun keeps firing round after round after round. The weapon that works is the superior weapon. Everything else is just numbers on paper and pride that cannot survive contact with reality. Richter had learned that lesson in the ruins of Stalingrad, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life, along with the crude, gap-filled, simple Soviet weapon that had proven more valuable than all the precision engineering in the world. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.